Welcome to the Brothers and Books Podcast. Read all day Brothers and Books Podcast by Hyatt.
Welcome to the Brothers and Books Podcast, episode 2. Today we'll be speaking to Keith Banks, Australian author, Australian police officer, and one of the most decorated police officers in the history of the Australian policing units. Keith spent time undercover as a young man in the early 1980s in the Australian Police Force, and today we'll be talking about the morality of being undercover and doing things that you wouldn't do or get arrested for doing, and then also trying to live a good life whilst on the side and not allowing that to affect him. I think it's quite interesting because in everyone's lives, like yours or mine, we do have that duality of good and evil between us. However, this is quite black and white with Keith's career, having to do it for a job and then maintaining the fact that he was a good person at heart. So I'm very excited to talk to him about that. We'll also be talking to Keith Banks about his time in the CERT Tactical Action Group of the police force and how he amped himself up to be able to do the jobs that he did whilst acting as the equivalent of the Special Forces branch of the Australian Defence Force in the Police Tactical Action Unit, how he dealt with the stress during and then post the event itself as well. We'll be talking to Keith about which books he'd recommend to ourselves to live a fulfilling life, and of course asking Keith about the advice that he would give to ourselves to live a fulfilling life. As always, make sure you subscribe and like below. And if you want to see someone specifically on the podcast, feel free to leave a comment below. If you haven't already, check out the Brothers and Books Instagram. And I hope you enjoy today's podcast and get something out of it like I did as well. Keith Banks, how are you? Welcome to the first ever guest podcast. And it's yourself, mate, which I'm stoked about. How have you been?
Oh, mate, first of all, thank you, brother. That's a big honour. I've been a big supporter of yours and what you're doing for a long time. Mate, yeah, pretty good, brother. Pretty good. Just finished a stage of my life where I've walked away from an executive role and I'm just feeling the peace. So, yeah, pretty cruisy.
Yes. And how long ago was that?
Mate, so, what's today? Sunday. So 2 days ago. Yeah, 2 days ago. After 5 years of...
Oh, mate, this is HR for yourself.
Yeah, mate. Well, look, I've been in the corporate world ever since I left the cops, and yeah, it's just time to leave and smell the roses and just enjoy life a little more.
Is there any future plans for yourself?
Mate, early days. I really want to write more. Now that I've written and published 2 books, as you know, I've got the bug. So I'm really keen to just look at what else I can write about and what other avenues of life, and particularly revolving around crime and punishment, I suppose, without taking license from that famous mission, right?
Fyodor Dostoevsky. Yeah.
Thank you. But yeah, mate. And look, I'm very keen to do some speaking engagements and talk to people about my experiences and my learnings. I want to work with. I'm working with a foundation voluntarily for mental health. So yeah, a lot of things that I really just want. I will now have the time to devote my passion to, whereas before I was sort of fitting in around the almighty corporate giant attitude or culture.
Working for the dollar, working for the man. Now, you mentioned your books, mate. I've got them here. I've got them here. So, Drugs, Guns, and Lies, and then Gun to the Head. And I'll just say, like, obviously, I read a lot of books, but your writing style, I'm glad you've got more time to write. Your writing style, to me, it's very succinct. The chapters all tell their own story. It's such an easy read, mate. And I think, not only the lessons that you bring across in the books because of your experiences, but damn, your writing style is super easy to read. And people always talk about like these big books that they're reading. Like I think sometimes mainly for dramatic effect. But your books are so easy to read, and you heard it here first on the podcast. Keith's looking for some speaking opportunities. So if you're a small business that wants to get Keith involved, you can find him on Instagram, just at Banksy, and I've tagged him as well all over Brothers and Books. Keith, for the first question today, I've already introduced you in my little intro video. However, do you want to go through your background, mate, where you grew up, in Australia, and then sort of your career in broad brush before we start speaking about some of your books and some of your experiences.
Yeah, sure, mate. So I was born in Sydney. My parents split up before I think I may have been 12 months old, don't know. My mother moved back to Queensland, where she was from in the country, a little place near Charleville called Tambo. Um, we were there, I think, 5 or 6 years or something. She met um, a person and remarried. He was an unskilled labourer, so we started moving around where the work was, basically. So I grew up in that environment, caravan parks and so on. He wasn't a very pleasant individual. He had a problem with alcohol. He had a problem with anger. Um, Took that out on me as a little kid. And I look back on that and think, what a terrible bloody thing to do to a 6-year-old kid and thereon. But yeah, he used to bash me a fair bit. And he eventually moved that anger to my mother and, the typical domestic violence situation. In those days, women had very little power, if any. So there was nowhere for her to go, nowhere to escape. There was no family law court judgment requiring him to pay her money, all of that stuff. So she was like thousands of women and probably more in that generation. She was actually stuck in a marriage that she couldn't walk away from. And so it was an interesting child. When I say interesting, it was a challenging childhood for me in a number of ways. But I was really lucky because I was academically bright, and I remember finding refuge when I was old enough. It might have been 10 or 11 or something to get a library membership, maybe a bit older. And I'd actually escaped to the library, and I would literally spend hours in the library, and that probably resulted in increasing my love of books and reading, and that ability to escape or to to find other worlds or to learn about other things and other opportunities and other life. Because when you're in that environment as a little kid, you think that's what it's going to be like forever, and it's very difficult to see the end of that time. So then, lucky.
And 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 sorry, Keith. I know I've bumsteered you to say I'd love to hear about a big overarching thing, but I think life gives you different lessons, and you've got your first one, and now divorce and
Mm,
even domestic violence in the home. Like it's actually very common. Like I think the divorce rate currently sits over 50%, and it's actually
yeah,
continuing to decline. So that's something everybody goes through. So I think like that'll be one of the first key lessons that you could probably give to the audience today. That escape mechanism and reading as well. And I know that you hinted on discovering different worlds, and when you're in a bad place, it may seem like that is everything. But the library really helped you, and reading books helped you, mate. So that's really interesting to
mm,
me, and I think a lot of people can relate to that. I know my parents are divorced, and like I said, it's over 50%. So yeah, sorry to stop you there, but rather than books, yeah, that's an interesting way to escape from at least that specific part of adversity in your life.
yeah, absolutely. Books are incredibly powerful, mate. And you and I are in furious agreement about this. And a lot of men, particularly, haven't opened up their minds to read books, which is why I love what you're doing. Um, so you had the opportunity there to academically succeed. I won a couple of Commonwealth scholarships back in the day. If you'd sit an exam and there was a financial scholarship that actually allowed me. Well, we finally settled in Charters Towers. I won't go through the whole moving around stuff. I went to bloody hell, I don't know, 10 or 11 different schools. Um, Eventually ended up in Charters Towers. I was lucky enough to get a scholarship which allowed me to go to a private school as a day student, and that was funded by me, and a bursary from the school. So, but during that, I had developed an attitude that was I was planning my escape essentially, and I still call it at the age of almost 64. When I was 16, I escaped from that life, and I joined the army cadets, and I loved it. I just fell in love with the whole structure, discipline, training, camaraderie, strong male role models. It doesn't take a shrink to figure out why that would have been. And and I progressed pretty quickly through the ranks. I'm at the end of year 11, I was a cadet under officer. So, had the PIP, blah, blah, blah. But I just loved the whole concept. And my career path was going to be RMC, or as it was in those days, Duntroon. But I couldn't stay another 12 months in that house environment, in just that horrible, seething, angry, violent environment. And not long before, I think it might have been about end of year 10 or something, they had a police recruiting guy who came to school, and I'd always been interested in being a cop. The whole protect people from bullies thing, and I think the vast majority of police join because of that in some way, some level, some degree, or they join the ADF because it is a normal human reaction, I think, to want to be part of a protector, to have that protective mechanism. And if you're a little bit nuts, a bit alpha male, then you really want to get out there and do something that's a bit serious. So basically, applied for the police academy, got to the academy, got accepted. So I went there the year I turned 17. Did 2 years of training there, which was year 12. So a matriculation year 12, then another 12 months of police training. But all through that, it was probably similar to Duntroon. It was being screamed at 5 o'clock in the morning, drag out of bed, prepare your room for room inspection, marching drill, blah, 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 study, class, PT, more marching, more PT, more punishment, and all that sort of stuff. So I did 2 years of that. Oh, and haircuts, and I hated haircuts. So did 2 years of that, and then
Still do.
yes, I still do. You're right. See, there's a psychological scar right there. But then I got sworn in when I turned 19, so I had to wait 5 months to be sworn in at 19. And I think back, mate, and I go, Jesus Christ, I was a baby. So there I was, 19, with a firearm. Well, I didn't carry a firearm for a while, but because it was voluntary. But yeah, with the ability to carry a firearm, powers of arrest, etc. Walked the beat. Got into mobile patrols, which was a fantastic place to work, where you worked with a permanent partner, permanent sectors, no paperwork or no files and all that usual banal stuff that a lot of cops have to do. We just spent time on the road responding to jobs and locking up bad guys. And it was actually straight out of, the Los Angeles Police Department playbook. It was actually a great place to work. And then volunteered for Deep Undercover. Spent a couple of years Deep Undercover, came back, became a detective, fell in love with adrenaline and joined the tactical world. Then spent, I think, about 8 years in the tactical world. Moved to criminal intelligence, surveillance, covert stuff. So intelligence, tactical and strategic intel. And then went back to the major crime squad and resigned in 95. There's your broad brush, mate. And I went down a couple of rabbit holes, I know, but as you know, I tend to do that.
No rabbit holes, mate. That's perfect. And now, so as you know, people live to get inside of other people's head. It's why they read books. It's why they listen to podcasts. It's why every time you meet someone, the first question out of your own mouth is, "What do you do for a living?" And now your occupation, an undercover police officer, one of the first roles, mate. You must have spent the last 40-something years, getting this question. So Keith Banks, for probably the 1 millionth time, undercover policing, what is it like? And now I've specifically heard you talk, and I've read your books about seeing bad people do good things and good people do bad things. So I'd really like to listen to you speak today about the undercover world and some of the shocks and surprises that you found whilst you were actually in there. And I could imagine it's almost like an alternate reality. And I think I've heard you speak about that on the Instruction Sold Separately podcast. There's this whole other world going on. The importation of drugs into a country still exists. Those people still do it every day. And we're talking large sums of money that exists in our communities, but it's not something that the everyday person, unless they go looking for it, would ever see, even if when they go looking for it, that they would see. And now you were privy to a lot of it from a young age in the early 80s. So do you want to talk about some of the experiences that you had undercover, but also some of the lessons that you learnt about what goes on where people can't see and where maybe the mainstream media doesn't cover?
Yeah, oh, good. Yeah, mate, absolutely. So it's probably important to start with a lot of people have a misconception about what undercover cops do. And I see it used often mistakenly in the media and conversations where people say, oh, an undercover cop came and grabbed me in a pub. Well, that's not an undercover cop. That's just a cop who's wearing a pair of jeans and bloody runners and, a scruffy T-shirt maybe. The whole world of undercover involves changing your identity and leaving behind any trace of policing that you have. And um, it involves using fake identities and backstories. So you actually literally become someone else. And there is no 8 to 4, 4 to midnight shift in undercover. You are living in the world of crime. You are living, portraying yourself as a criminal, and it never switches off. So undercover for me, I started in March 1980. I wasn't even yet 22 years old. And I was out buying drugs initially through informers who introduced me to their drug dealing network and vouched for me as whatever identity I was using, whatever name I was using. And I'd then work on those people. I'd literally buy drugs. I'd buy larger amounts of drugs. I'd work my way up the chain until I got to the major drug dealer that we were after. Set up a major drug deal with that person. I think my first one might have been, it's pretty small comparatively now, but £5 of dope, which in Brisbane in 1980 was a pretty substantial amount of gear as far as cannabis is concerned. We'll talk about heroin in a minute, but so £5 of dope, and it was the car park of the Woolworths in Toowong, and I remember that because when I gave the signal, finally the backup guys swooped in and arrested both of us, because you're still arrested as an undercover. And I remember that because the side of my face was pretty quickly acquainted with the bitumen on the car park, and I've got a set of handcuffs around and a gun to my head, and I thought, Jesus, I hope they remember that I'm the good guy here. And then when the job was finished, in a very strange Wild West way to do things, man, they would always blow the cover of the undercover. So essentially, I'd be saying, sorry, I'd be brought in and they'd say, you have been selling drugs to an undercover agent, and here's his name, and then you'd move on to the next job. So it was quite bizarre.
Mate, that's super interesting that they obviously, like, you would assume that there are smarter minds than yours or mine, well, maybe mine at least, planning this on a strategic level to make sure that they can blow your cover in a way that doesn't ripple out to the community. Like, you'd want to bloody hope that you've got this guy that you're taking down, it's like full phone contact list to make sure that it's not going to get out, and then that you're holding them for a long period of time as well, like, if it goes through the court system, so you can't run and tell everybody else that this slick haircut beard wearing bloody Keith Banks, or another name, obviously, when you're undercover, is working for the bloody feds, mate. So it's a pretty bloody stressful time. And I know the managerial side of it, like even the reporting, you've said in other podcasts, like wasn't that big, so it's not like you're tying in every week. Like, you tie in where you could, but it wasn't like a set, very a lot of like coordinating controls over this period of time. You're just doing your job.
Yeah.
And you mentioned that it's a whole other world. Like, you live and breathe undercover. It's what you do. You wake up every day, you go out, you're buying drugs and stuff. Do you want to take us through, like, mate, it doesn't even need to be like a takedown, but what are you doing when you're undercover? Like, just one day undercover, in the 80s as a police officer. Like, what do you do?
Well, mate, see, you've hit it on the head. It was very badly managed. Undercovers were we were sort of regarded like there's a phrase I've used called meat on the hoof, which is a Queensland term for cattle that are being bred for slaughter, and that's the way we were regarded. We were a means to an end. So a lot of detectives got promoted on the work that we did because they'd swan in after we'd been literally working on someone for 3 or 6 months, make all the arrests of the drug buyers that we'd put ourselves at risk to do, and then look like geniuses. So with Undercover, there was no supervision, there was no psychological support. Before I answer your question, one of the things that sticks with me, and I have spoken about, is I set up to buy a couple of grams of speed, not methamphet, as it is known now, but it was basic backyard amphetamine. God knows what was in it. And I went to this guy's place in a squat in Corro Drive in Brisbane, which is now in Auchenflower, which is now, as you know, multi-million-dollar area. And walked in, he opened the door, and it was clear to me he was off his nut. He'd been sampling his product way too much. Thought, okay, I'll be here for 10 minutes. I'll quickly make the deal and I'll leave. And there was no backup. This is the important thing to point out. There was no surveillance team following us. That would only happen at the end of an operation, or maybe close to that. No one knew where we were. Certainly didn't know where I was. And I'd just go and I'd meet people, and I'd go to their place, or I'd go to a pub, or I'd go to a park and make drug deals and walk away. So in essence, sat down, and I said, okay, met you a couple of days ago. I'm here to buy the gear. And he started chopping a couple of lines up. So he sold me the couple of grams, started chopping a couple of lines, and he said, so sit down, we're going to do a rail, do a line, whatever the terminology was then. And I said, mate, I don't use. And he pulled out a double-barreled Coach sawn-off shotgun, a Coach gun, where the stock is cut down, the barrels are cut off, so it becomes quite a very handy concealable weapon. And with an SSG or an SG round, it'll cut you in half, as you'd know. And he put it on the table, pointed it at me, cocked both hammers back, and said, "Either you do a line with me, I'm gonna either blow your guts out or shoot you in the chest or something." And as you would do in that circumstance, I just sat down and said, "Okay, where's the straw?" I'd never used drugs in my life. I'd never even smoked a cigarette. I'd had probably by that stage maybe a couple of beers ever. And here I was sitting in a filthy bloody squat flat in Auchenflower doing 2 lines of speed with this guy. And did the deal, got in the car, having no idea what was happening to me because I was speeding off my nut. And when it snuck into the office the next day to make a report. And I remember vividly this detective said, "Oh, yeah, okay, yeah, righto. So he's got a gun, we'll put that in the running sheet." Not, "How are you? Are you okay? How are you feeling, mate? Can I do anything for you?" None of that. So it was just an incredibly unprofessional and Wild West approach to undercovers. So the typical life of an undercover agent, to get back, mate, would depend on where I was. So we'd be sent, so I'd finished that job in Brisbane. I was sent to Townsville, away somewhere where no one else had known me. Then when I finished in Townsville, I was sent to Mount Isa. Did some jobs in Mount Isa. I worked in North Queensland. Then I'd go back to Brisbane again. I'd, shave my beard off, change my appearance as much as I could, do more jobs around there. Then sent to the Gold Coast. I actually did a job on Hayman Island once, which was quite nice, as a staff member. But typical day is you wake up and you go, rightio, here we go again. Who have I got to see today? I'm going to see Dylan, the heroin dealer. Then I'm going to go and see Fred, the weed dealer. Then I'm going to go and see Ralph, the acid dealer. And you'd spend your day just going and buying drugs.
You keep that disclosed, mate, about who's dealing heroin around here on this bloody podcast. Mate, that's super interesting. So
that was Dylan with the D-I.
Oh, yeah. You can't trust that, Dylan. Mate, so what's super interesting is, so like it's 24/7, obviously. Yeah. It's 24/7. Yeah. At what part in the day, do you be your usual self? Do you be the Keith Banks that went to the library as a child and read all these books to deal with what was going on at home? At what point in the day? Now, everybody lives their days doing different things. Like when you're at work, you're a different person to what you are maybe. When you're in the gym, you're a different person. And a lot of people ground themselves when they're meditating, and maybe that's when they feel like they're most themselves. But for you, obviously, you're in it all the time. I'd like something similar, maybe entrepreneurialism, business, you're always thinking about it.
Mm.
At what point do you stop and enjoy yourself? I can't imagine you would have had a big social life, moving around, doing different undercover jobs, and you definitely can't talk about what you're doing to anybody unless you're prepared to cop that bloody sawn-off shotgun round.
Mm.
So, at what part of the day, because you did it for 3 years, at what time do you come back to being yourself and being like, hang on a minute, like I'm not a bloody drug dealing crook. I'm like a decent bloody human being that wanted to help people.
Mate, the only time as an undercover that you can actually be yourself is between jobs, or when you're with other undercovers. So, if you think about it, so I was in Cairns doing a job in Cairns for shit, I don't know. First one was 3 months. I think the next time I was up there was 4 or 5 months or something. When you're back in your rented place, dealers know where you live because that's part of the in the weed network. It's very social, so people expect that you'll socialize with them. Even though you're buying pounds of setting up pounds and pounds. Um, in the heroin industry, if you're dealing with good dealers, they don't want to socialize; they want to get business done. But you still have to have an ability to sometimes tell them where you live. It's not always, but sometimes. So I'd be sitting at home. So I was sitting at home on the Gold Coast when I was buying a substantial amount of heroin from a lot of dealers down there, and a woman that had been my conduit into. I started scoring from her first, and then conduit into the wider network and working my way up the dealer network. She knocked on the door one night with a couple of bottles of Cinzano and a very small bikini top, and she was pretty hot. And I had to do two things. I had to launch straight back into the heroin dealer cover that I had as the hard heroin dealer. And secondly, how the hell do I get her out of here? Because if she stayed in that in my unit, and bear in mind, she was pretty hot and I was a young bloke, I didn't want nature to take its course
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
because that then, in a later court case, could have completely screwed everything up. Unethical as well, but certainly from a legal perspective. And so you could never really be off your guard. When you're away on an operation, you live that life 24 hours a day. So when I'd come back to Brisbane, and if there were a couple of the other undercover guys in between jobs, we'd hang together. We'd go to a pub and drink beer together. And from the outside, we looked like some pretty sus characters, I guess. But we could actually be ourselves and our individual personalities only then. So we formed a really tight kinship. But it's, I reflect on it, mate. So we'd be, say, sitting at the Brecky Creek in the old days before the creek became gentrified. If someone came up to the table, we'd automatically switch back into our personas from who we were as real people. It's a really interesting psychological thing to look back on, how, everybody has different facades depending on who we're speaking to in life, in business, in relationships. And in undercover, it's exacerbated massively because you have to still pretend to be the bad guy when outsiders arrive, if that makes sense.
Yeah, mate, that makes a lot of sense, and I think you've done a really good job at explaining what it's like to be an undercover cop. Because if we were to break anyone's life down into phases, they could see in different phases. I was interested in this at this specific part of my life, but then later I grew and I became interested in that. And it sounds like undercover policing. You're working a job for a couple of months. That's who you are for that time period of your life. And let's say it's not your job. That's who you were. You were living in Cairns. You enjoyed smoking dope and selling weed. But then you moved to the Gold Coast and, you had this potential opportunity for a female with the opposite sex. That is no different to how any of us live our lives, right?
Yeah.
Essentially, but you're getting paid to do it and you're doing a good thing for the community and for society. But I think that would be the best way for me to be able to rationalize what it would be like to be an undercover detective. It's no different to any of the phases that we go in life. But what I find most interesting is that in your story, it's very easy to draw the line between black and white. Good Keith Banks and bad Keith Banks. Insert pseudo name for that time period, where that's quite like everyone in our life, and I'm sure you'd be the same. I'm the same. Not even working undercover, obviously. I have times where maybe I'm not the best person that I could be, or I'm doing things that maybe wouldn't benefit other people. But then other times I like to try and hold myself as an altruistic person. But in your job role, it's so clear cut. But I don't think it's any different to anybody else. And um, I said I'd mention this. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, when talking about Russian communism and the Gulag system, and who's good and who's bad, it's not groups of people ever. It's always individuals. And I think that your books do a great job at defining that. And Solzhenitsyn says that the line between good and evil doesn't run between party lines or political lines or belief lines. The line between good and evil runs between the heart of every single individual. And talking to someone like yourself, you can definitely see that. And you've said before that, you had drug dealing friends, when you're undercover, that you prefer to the good guys, the cops, mate. So
Yeah.
I'm interested to hear, what your opinion is on, what makes a good person, and what makes a bad person, in policing world and in the drug world as well, because I think that's a pretty unique perspective that you must have on society in general. And I know that you're smart enough and you're quite philosophical to speak about that, mate. So I think people would be interested to know what values you look for in human beings that are positive values, regardless of whatever occupation they've fallen into because of whatever upbringing that they've had.
Yeah, that's a great question, mate. And you're right. I as an undercover operative, no one that I dealt with in the drug dealing world or the criminal world or the selling stolen property world or whatever ever knew what my real occupation was. So I had these personal relationships that I formed with people, and I'd know it. And the interesting thing was I'd know what they were doing because I was buying drugs from them, or they were facilitating drug deals for me. So I knew what they were all about. They didn't know what I was about. And that's another challenging thing about undercover, just before I get back into what you're saying, is um, you actually meet people knowing full well that you will betray them, that you will absolutely betray them. And that's a challenging thing for any human being with a trace of conscience or empathy to do. You know, I met some heroin dealers who were just scumbags who had no care or concern about the damage and the death that their product was causing. I had no issue with working on them and sending them to jail at all. In fact, quite the opposite. I quite enjoyed it. But I met some people in that world who were selling lots of weed, for instance. And probably in my mind, I differentiated between the two. Um, I didn't see weed as a great evil. But I met people who were doing very bloody well at it, making a lot of black money, but who were actually good people, who were good. They were fun to be with. They were faithful to their partner. They were family people sometimes. They loved their kids. They were generous. They were, just really good people. And then at the same time, I was dealing with some police, not a lot, because the majority of police, and I say this every opportunity, mate, the majority of police I ever had the honour to work with were straight, honest, good people who were there for the right reasons. But there was certainly a cohort of weak individuals who were selfish and all about themselves, who were probably selling more drugs back on the streets than we were taking off the streets, who were ripping off drug dealers, stealing their cash, who were facilitating, some criminal offences by crooks and protecting them and getting kickbacks from that. History shows certainly that the police commissioner who went to jail for 12 or 13 years, history shows he was found guilty of major corruption. There were people in that line of command under him who were very influential, who were controlling it. So here I was, I'm living, in a world where I was carrying a gun most of the time, a little automatic pistol, or sometimes, a 357 Magnum, depending on who I was dealing with. But I'm living in a world where I'm always on edge. I'm always conscious of who I am as a person, and maintaining that moral compass, yet living in a world that was very tempting, believe me. Some undercovers have actually crossed the line, because it's a tempting world. It's easy cash, all that stuff. So maintaining all of that. And then knowing full well that some detectives in the drug squad office were bent, corrupt bastards who I would not have spat on. So I much preferred the company of some drug dealers as opposed to the company of some coppers. And these coppers had personality traits that I despised, which were, regardless of your sense of morality, they're playing up on their wives, they're, drinking free grog, they're taking bribes, they're, bashing people in handcuffs, all that shit that really it never sat well with me at all. And here I am out there in this supposed world of crime, preferring to hang and have beers with blokes that I know I'm going to betray. Quite a challenging life to lead, and it's quite, in hindsight, quite challenging to maintain that level of human interaction. So to answer your question, mate, what I look for in people now, I'll start with what I don't like. What I don't like is duplicity, hypocrisy, and self-centeredness. And I've come across a fair bit of that in the corporate world, believe me. The corporate psychopath is alive and well. The narcissists are alive and well. What I do look for is people who are bloody genuine human beings, who what you see is what you get. They can be rough truck drivers, they're good people, what I mean by that is they'll help you out. They'll give you the shirt off their back. They'll have time for you. They'll pick up an animal on the side of the road and take it to a vet, that sort of stuff. But there are human beings out there that I would happily throat punch.
And the reason I ask you that question is because I think it's important to look at individuals on their individual merits, especially in policing or the undercover world or just any really context in life. Because if you're looking at people through the lens of, and duplicity is a good one. People live their whole lives lying. You mentioned, maybe they cheat on their partner or they're not faithful or they're not truthful about it. Go about your everyday. But if you're lying about these things, that's where I think, people live double lives all the time, maybe not undercover with bloody guns to their head, but they live double lives. So I asked that, and I think in society today, and we saw it recently, people looking, especially in the policing world, coming into the legal side of things, people look at groups of people when assessing individual actions. And we saw just last week the court case of Zachary Rolfe, the policeman in the Northern Territory, who was found not guilty of when trying to arrest a young Aboriginal man having to use lethal force after being stabbed by a pair of scissors. And I think it's always interesting watching, not the fear mongering is the wrong word, but the divide of people based off of things that are unimportant, which is, creed, religion, skin color, sexuality. Who cares? If you look at the individuals, you've got a man who's a police officer, I believe a decorated police officer, ex-infantry soldier, someone like ourselves who's tried to, joined up for the greater good. And in this specific circumstance, while I don't have the background history of this young Aboriginal man, his actions on the day were not the best, were of someone who is a bad person in that specific time period by, reacting and stabbing a police officer when he's obviously done the wrong thing in the past. And he had an opportunity to be a good person in that specific thing. And while the law has sorted it out so far, it's very upsetting when people say that this is a complex issue, this shouldn't have happened, and any loss of life is a great tragedy. I'm sure you and I agree on that, of course. But in this particular circumstance, if you view it through a lens of anything other than the individual's actions at that specific time, it just gets muddied, and it's not looking at what's important. It's bringing in cultural issues. It's bringing in all of these complexities that people can't do a lot about into a situation that doesn't allow for it. So I think that individuality part is so important, mate.
Oh, I agree, mate. And what frustrates me is that the media and certain other groups put a racist narrative on that situation. Now, I've seen the body camera footage that was banned in the Northern Territory. I saw it when the Channel 7 report was done some months ago. And all this boils down to is one human being, using surgical scissors to try and murder two police officers. There is no other way to put it. And it's all very good for people to sit back with the power of a pause button and look at a body camera footage and go, oh, he should have taken a step this way, he should have done this, he should have done that. And the people who are making that commentary have never seen an angry man in our parlance. And it simply comes down to, if someone was trying to stab me with surgical scissors and hit me in the shoulder when they're aiming for my carotid, and the evidence showed that he was actually aiming for the neck, then knife does equal gun, and you use sufficient force in that moment of terror and fear and alarm to save your life and the life of another. There is no racist undertone. It simply happened on an Indigenous community. It could have also happened in Queen Street in Brisbane, and it's frustrating that.
Yep.
And you're right that that groups are condemned and criticised when it should simply be an individual or an assessment of an individual scenario. There's a whole lot of stuff happening with the Zach Rolfe matter that infuriates me because, as you know, you've read my books, I've been involved in shootings and I've certainly been involved in a fatal shooting of an offender. Now, our case went to a coronial inquest, as every other police shooting ever does. In the Northern Territory, they raced to charge him with murder. And that is, in my view, a total knee-jerk reaction to a Black Lives Matter narrative that was immediately taken up by the community. And I've got to call it as it is, rather than two police officers with their lives at risk and threat, and they took appropriate action. And the jury saw that, and they've brought back not guilty. Now, this matter hasn't finished because the Northern Territory Police are now pursuing Zach Rolfe with internal disciplinary matters, one of which was making an unauthorised media comment on the steps of the court when he said this has been a tragic day for everybody. For God's sake. And you're right, mate. It's
I do.
Drives me mental.
Oh, sorry. I do feel for. Yeah, I do feel for the individual, because the comments were something like, this is a tragic day for everybody. It's not my place to say anything. I want the family of the bereaved and the mourning to speak. It's not for me to speak. I've tried to do my job, and obviously I'm misquoting, but something along those lines. And it's like, for God's sake, like, chasing this rabbit hole, putting labels on things that don't require it. And sure, there's so much, conversation around these communities, and everybody, most people would want the best for everyone in this situation. But it's just absolutely tragic. And actually, mate, this brings us on to the next topic, because you have been directly involved with a situation similar to the one that we saw recently in the Northern Territory, but unfortunately had a very different outcome. And instead of surgical scissors, was a rifle. So, mate, do you want to take us through? Now, we're jumping ahead of ourselves a little, or I am. Obviously, this is at the time you're in the tactical action group of the police, and was the day that Paul Mullins was fatally shot and killed, and also obviously the tragedy that was your good friend Peter Kidd passing away as a result of that tactical action. Do you want to just talk us through everything in that circumstance? Yeah. And I actually think it might bring to light what's going on in more recent history with everything, and what could happen, if God forbid, more people lose their lives in a situation like this. Obviously, the net outcome, a utilitarian look at it, would say that that's a worse outcome than what occurred in the Northern Territory, albeit both very bloody tragic.
Yeah, totally agree, mate. It's there are some good parallels, actually. So, 1987, I'd actually I'd finished undercover in, God knows, 83 or something. As I said before, I went back to uniform for 6 months, and then applied for a detective's position, got that, worked in the drug squad, break and enter squad, and ended up in a suburban CIB at Taringa and loved it. And I just, very quickly after leaving undercover, I knew that I had an addiction to adrenaline. And that's an alpha male thing. I don't think it's a bad thing, but I wanted to be at the sharp end of everything, right? And I found out that, when I found out, I think I saw a news report about the emergency squad, as it was then known, which was a squad that had been formed in the late 60s, I think, or maybe early 70s, to deal with domestic sieges, the stuff that normal cops weren't equipped or trained for. So they, that they were wearing black jumpsuits, and I thought, I need to get me a bit of that. So I applied for that and moved into that as a part-time operator around the time of the Commonwealth Games, I think, when funding was being provided from a national level. So equipment was being updated. The SASR counter-terrorist guys were coming over to train the squads around the country. So, it was a really interesting, exciting time to be part of it, because the professionalism was ramping up. So I'd been doing that part-time for a few years. Then there was an evolution to create a full-time component of that tactical response group work. So, because we'd basically been part-timers, and that was the model around the country. So full-time was created. I started, I was actually sent to Campbell Barracks, SASR in Swanbourne, to do a police counter-terrorist instructors course. So I was over there for all up about 4 weeks, and just having a ball, just blowing shit up and shooting stuff, and smashing windows, and learning how to run operations and do emergency action plans, deliberate option plans, and just having a ton of fun, as you would. So I was 29 and team leader, etc. So, really on top of my game, and I put in my second book. It sounds arrogant, but it was the fact. I was fit, I was strong, I was on top of my game, I was bloody good at what I did. Excellent shot, blah, blah, blah. So I came back, and about a month after I came back to my full-time position and resumed it, we were briefed on a target, Paul James Mullen. And Mullen was an escapee from Long Bay Jail. I think he'd been on the run for maybe 7 years. Violent bastard. He'd bashed a contractor who was coming into the jail, stole his ute, and I mean bashed him almost in a vegetative state. He had shot in cold blood a security guard, I think in Perth, for no reason apart from the fact he just shot him during a bank robbery, and shot another guy in Sydney and crippled him. I think he killed the guy in Perth. But just a violent bloke, a psychopath, no remorse. Had been in the army for a while, so he was a pretty good shot. He was a bushman. He was living on the run in various parts of New South Wales and Queensland, and I think South Australia, living in the bush, emerging to do armed hold-ups or armed robberies, getting the cash, and then moving into state, etc. So he had committed, I think maybe 3 or 4 armed robberies around the Brisbane area, and he'd been identified because, as the armed robbery squad did then, they looked at surveillance photos, etc., and they realised it was him. What prompted our involvement from a tactical operator perspective, and tactical operator being the sharp end of the spear, we were the last resort, trained, equipped, etc. And he had committed an armed robbery in Toombul in Brisbane, I think it was Toombul, ran out of the bank and was tackled by a bystander who was just walking past. And Mullen was only about 5'6", I reckon. So what's that, 170 centimetres? So nuggety guy, but just, not big. And he ran out of the bank with his favourite weapon, which was a 223 Mini 14 Ruger, 30-round mag, sawn off stock from memory, into a pistol grip, and he was tackled. And they fought over the money, fought over the gun. And this guy had a ton of balls, whoever the bystander was. And anyway, Mullen escaped with the rifle, but left about 30 grand behind. He was at that time living in a house in Virginia. And he and his de facto partner, I love it, it's still a good old-fashioned police term, means some woman he was living with, were living in the house with her 2 children. And I think the kids were around 9 and 7 or something around there, 2 boys. And they had a nanny or a housekeeper who was in, and she heard Mullen screaming at the television because this particular television channel had an interview with the bystander. They gave his full name and the suburb that he lived in. and believe me, mate, it was easy to find people, and probably still is, through certain ways, particularly if you've got their name in their suburb. And Mullen was screaming at the television, and I won't use the exact words, but it was essentially, I'm going to find you and I'm going to kill you, blah, blah, blah. Now, the nanny knew full well that he was a crook. But in that great Australian way, she thought, oh, none of my business. And she was probably on the fringes of it anyway. She knew that there were guns in the house, etc. But this really scared her because she hadn't seen him like this. So she basically, within a day, rang the Redcliffe police station, I think, and was put on to, because she was living out there, she was put on to a detective, a great bloke, who started the job, interviewed her, got statements, and then got the armed robbery squad involved, got the surveillance guys involved, and they sat off this house and identified that Mullen was in there. So we were tasked with putting an operation order together to arrest him. Now, we looked at, do we take him out in traffic? Given his history with firearms and the fact he was always armed, discounted that quickly, because if he'd opened up on us at 2 to 3, as you know, first catch, first graze, what are you looking at, a couple of Ks? So, sorry, for civilian listeners, the bullet would have gone a long way and potentially killed or badly wounded bystanders. So we went, can't do that. For the same reason, we discounted taking him out if he was walking to the shop, because he would have just opened up on us as well. And we were left with the only option, which was to smash in through his door and effect an entry into his house. We'd done that, mate, hundreds of times. I count probably more, maybe a couple of thousand times over the years. And we always went in at the time we chose, generally 3 o'clock in the morning when the circadian rhythms are down, or people are in deep sleep, so they're groggy. We used, didn't use distraction grenades because they were only fairly new, but we'd done these jobs heaps of times. So I sat with another guy and we put an operation order together, which was the classic old SMEAC. And my plan was to utilise tear gas, distraction grenades or stun grenades, flashbangs. And flashbangs were fairly new; they hadn't been used before, and we had a stock of them. And I was trained in them. And I thought, we'll go in, a couple of flashbangs into the bedroom, which will distract him and give us time to get in there and put him down, as in arrest him. So in essence, mate, planned this. The operation order went to the command level, and it came back and it was amended drastically. So we weren't allowed to use tear gas. We weren't allowed to use flashbangs. I was angry about this for years. The fact that it was interfered with and the tools that we had were taken away. I genuinely think a couple of things happened to cause this. But I'll remind me of that, mate. I'll go back to that. But at any rate, so the plan came back and I was pretty pissed off. I went, okay, so the only other thing that I can do is any form of distraction, because any tactical entry on a stronghold, and that's the term we use for the house or building or whatever, you need to distract the enemy's attention. It's the same with you guys when you plan operations, I'm sure, in battle operations. You need flanking fire, you need artillery, whatever. Same principle. So I thought the only way I can get a distraction in place is to have a team under the bedroom window on the, as you looked at the house from the front on the right side, and that classic old Queensland with it, the land sloped down towards the front. So under the front of the house was probably 1.5 meters of space. So I put a ladder team there with the instruction that we were going to try to get covert entry. If they heard us smash the door with a hammer, they were to throw a ladder through his window as a distraction. So anyway, put that plan back to command, and they signed off on it. Right, so we weren't allowed to use gas, weren't allowed to use flashbangs. And I thought, Jesus, this isn't going to be good. And I just had a bloody bad feeling, about it. And intuition, I think you always should go with your gut feel. It's just that, it's that amygdala, it's that lizard brain, it's that. Going back to the caves when you might have had some intuition there was a bloody pterodactyl outside or whatever. And I just didn't feel right about it. And Peter Kidd had joined the team when I did, or the group when I did. We'd gone through our training together as tactical guys. He had done the SAS course the year before I was sent over. We had this really friendly rivalry about who was going to be promoted first, who was the best shot, all that stuff. And Pete and his wife had a stillborn birth not long before, which was tragic. And he was the only one of us in the entry team who was married. And so I just went through this thing, mate, where I didn't want him in the team. I didn't want him in that because I just didn't want his wife to go through any more grief, and I could feel something was not right with this bloody job. Anyway, to cut a long story short, Pete fought that, and an opportunity came up with my entry team that I'd put together. One of the guys withdrew for some personal reasons, and that's okay. So anyway, Pete came to me and said, mate, I'm the best one for the job. I am the best. And I said, yeah, I do know you're the best, mate. So I grudgingly put him in the team. And the Order of March haunted me for 25 years because as the team leader, I was the one who said who goes in first, second, third, and fourth. As the team leader, my position was number 4, and that's just the way it is. I tried to argue against it, and I was told, you're the team leader or you're not. Which one? Anyway, so I'm number 4. We had a group meeting, or the 4 of us sat and chatted about who was going to be number 1. My mate Steve had been number 1 on a number of, maybe half a dozen jobs before. And number 1 through the door is bloody scary, and there's a lot of stress. And we just said no. Steve needs a rest from that. So anyway, Peter was put in the number 1 in the door position. So we moved on the house. Another thing was we were told when to do the job, which we'd never been told before. We were told we had to go in at 5:30 on this particular morning, and it was a Wednesday morning. And I only realised later, after everything had happened that I'm about to tell you about, that was the bloody week that our Fitzgerald inquiry into police corruption had started. And the first 2 days, the media coverage was not complimentary, right? And I am firmly convinced that we were told to go in and do this job at this time on this morning because the police force wanted a front page story to take attention away from the corruption inquiry. I'm firmly convinced of it. And they got the story all right, but it wasn't the one that they were looking for. They wanted to have a, police arrest, number 1 most wanted. So it's about 5:30, pitch black. My team and I approached the rear door. We had an assault team number 2 behind us. I had my distraction team at the front of the house. I had inner cordon established with other members of the group. We had the dog squad on standby. It was a really bloody well-run operation, apart from the fact that I wasn't able to use the tools I wanted to use. So we tried to make covert entry, didn't work. So I've given the physical signal to smash the door. As soon as the first hit on the door happened, the distraction team at the front of the house did exactly what they were instructed to do. They threw a ladder through the bedroom window where the offender and his de facto partner were. And mate, within a half a second, I reckon, I heard 2 shots, heavy caliber shots from the bedroom. We found later that the offender had launched straight out of the mattress he was lying on the floor, grabbed his weapon and put 2 rounds through the skirting board where you would expect a ladder team was making entry. So it was on. It took us another probably 5 to 10 seconds to get through the back door because he had actually changed the way the door opened. Most doors open inwardly. He'd actually reversed it to open outwardly, which means an assault team takes longer to get in. So this was a guy who was living his life as a full professional criminal, violent armed robber. So he'd actually done that. When we got into the bedroom and he was dead, we found he had been attempting to get to a trapdoor that he'd built behind a set of drawers, which led to underneath the house. So he had his escape plan ready to go, all the time. So essentially, we made our way through a darkened house. We only had tiny little bloody mini mag lights on our weapons. The equipment wasn't that flash then compared to what it is now. Made our way through, clearing, calling out police don't move, as we were required to do legally. He'd already fired 2 rounds at the guys, and within 5 seconds, Pete and my team were at the bedroom door. As Pete was pushing open the bedroom door, there were I think 3 rounds or 2 rounds that came through the door and hit Pete in the chest. And I saw him crumple forward, and I saw him raise his Heckler and Koch MP5 to take aim at the offender. Then there were another 3. Pete was hit 5 times. There were another 3 shots. So I'm pretty sure it was 2 shots initially, then 3 shots inside the bedroom. And then the team went in. Number 2, the force of the shots when Pete was hit inside the room was such they knocked out. He was pushed back against the number 2 guy, and they fell to the floor. Number 3, who I was standing right beside, Steve, was shot at point blank, an inch above the groin, and that round actually picked him up and propelled him back into the corridor. And at that time, number 2, the assault team leader of number 2, who was tasked with going to the rear of the house to protect the kids, started engaging the offender from the cover of the bathroom. So he propped himself around the doorframe and started engaging him. And then I joined him, and we both charged into the room and killed the offender. Right? So never lost a moment's sleep over that, mate. Never have, never will. But then within, and it's hard to say because time slows down, all of the stuff that you read about the auditory exclusion is absolutely right. We didn't have ear protection. I remember when he was shooting back at us, because we fired at him and he fired back and we fired back at him. The sound was quite minimal from a 223 or a 556. Imagine that in a confined bedroom. It would be massively loud. I remember the rounds I was firing back at him just sounded like a tiny little pop gun. And in a bizarre thing that I can still remember, and my rounds were travelling at 860 feet per second, and I'm shooting at him from, I'm just picturing the doorway of my study, maybe a metre and a bit. That's how close it was. I can still see those rounds, my rounds, tracking through the air and hitting him in the body. I know it's impossible, but I can still see it in my mind's eye. It's bizarre. So he's down, dying in the corner. And then as I tracked across the room to clear the room, his female partner popped up from under the doona. And I lined her up, and and this is where it comes back to good and darkness, I guess. My amygdala was telling me, kill the bitch, just put one in her head, and then in that tiny little split second, my other side, moral compass, went, well, you can't do that. She's unarmed. Yeah, but I can lie about it later. And so there's this little tussle, and my moral compass kicked in. So I brought the weapon back and I went over to where Pete was, and it was tragic, mate. The poor bastard was dying. It was horrible. He was in incredible pain and anguish, and I was powerless. And someone dragged her out and dragged her away. And the ambos turned up and came in to treat him and so on. But one of the things, so 2 things, he died later that morning in hospital, and thank God Steve survived, although he nearly died. But we had been issued with level 2 vests. So you couldn't even call them ballistic vests, bullet-resistant vests. Level 2 vests were only suitable for a shotgun and handgun protection. Even a .22 rifle would have gone through them. Peter Kidd had, part of his role was equipment, and he had put an application into probably the same pricks that changed my operation plan for the ballistic vest to be updated urgently, and they came back and refused to because the budget didn't allow it. When he died that morning, magically, within, I reckon 3 to 4 weeks, the budget was found, and I was flown to Sydney to do ballistic testing on vests with ceramic plates that we, eventually decided on. That still makes me angry. And the struggles I went through for the next 25 years were survivor guilt. I understand survivor guilt. I understand post-traumatic stress now. I don't call it a disorder because I don't think it's a disorder, it's an injury. But none of us knew what it was then. I fell into this deep darkness and sadness and anguish and anger and anxiety and anger again. And I actually, I became, and it's still hard for me to admit it because at heart I'm a nice guy, but I became homicidal. I took, I think maybe a week's leave or something when my fiance and I went on a holiday to Airlie Beach. I couldn't wait to get back to work. I wanted to go back to work, and I wanted to go in there every day, put on my blacks, and wait for a job to give me an opportunity to drill someone, and I wanted to knock every crook I could find the opportunity to do so. Obviously, as revenge for Pete's death or murder. My shrink has told me to call it what it is. It's a murder. I saw my mate murdered. Um, and I went through, man. We talk about good and evil, and what I learned over my journey over the next couple of years is that we all carry darkness within us. We all do, regardless of whether we're a Catholic nun or Idi Amin. We've all got darkness, right, as human beings. Mine came to the fore, and I knew a couple of things happened. I was in another shooting. I was in some other stuff, and I could see that my darkness was taking over who I am as a person. So I made a decision to leave the tactical world, which broke my heart because that's all I ever wanted to do, was be at the sharp end and be one of those guys. Really hard, tough guys, as we used to call ourselves. We called ourselves RHTCs, but I'll replace the C with the guy, if you can get my drift. And I got there, and I was part of a team, and I was part of camaraderie, and I was with my brothers I loved, and we did helicopter raids and just loved it. That morning changed me completely, and it broke my heart, and I felt under supported, on behalf of us all, because some dickhead in a command structure didn't bother to ask what a stun grenade was, and I think that particular person, I won't name him even though he's deceased now, I think he looked at my operation order and went, grenades? We're not going to use grenades. No, that's not good. Rather than being a leader and asking the question, it's one of the things I learnt, mate, out of a horrible morning is don't assume shit. If you're not sure about something, ask someone to clarify. And as we said, it is still painful for me on some level to talk about that morning, but it's also cathartic because every time I do talk about it, I feel a little bit better. I could never tell the story without bursting into tears within the first 30 seconds, and I know there are people who listen to me talk about this, and I know there are people who've read my book about my descent into post-traumatic stress and my recovery from it, and I know that this conversation strikes a chord with a lot of people, man, a lot of ADF vets, a lot of first responders, a lot of police. And so every time I talk about it, I know somehow it'll be striking a chord with someone out there to go, shit, I'm not the only one who thinks this way. Because for a long time I thought I was. And so every chance I get to tell the story and particularly talk about recovery is pretty powerful on a number of levels. So, but you know what, man? Rest in peace, poor old Kitty. And that's just some days you can't foretell or forecast. And ironically, mate, Kitty was the only one who was upbeat in our assault truck on our way to that job. The other three of us just had this bad feeling that you can never put your finger on. And it was it was heartbreaking. His family, his dad, his mum, his wife, and us. We just felt such a massive sense of loss.
And mate, I appreciate your honesty, and I know for a fact that there's a reason that your book has over, I think it's over like 70 reviews on different platforms at the very least, both best-selling books, and for a reason, and it's because you do tell the story so honestly and without without any sort of bias. It is what it is, and your honesty and genuinity, I know that you mentioned those things as things that you look for in other people as positive traits. You do have them, and I think that is the reason why people resonate so deeply with your books. And I do also agree with you that people will listen to that and be able to resonate it with it, and maybe they've gone through something before. And like you said before, in the Defence Force, the veteran community, they have had to deal with things like you have, and that is a tragic story, obviously. And I appreciate you sharing it this morning. I know that your battles with post-traumatic stress post this incident did lead you to leave the tactical assault group, like you said. And I know that there's been decades of work on yourself that you have gone through, and you can read about it in your books. But and I don't want to make it less than what it is, but I know that you will have some thoughts on the most therapeutic, beneficial things that you have done to get through it. You mentioned therapy before, but was there any sort of education or knowledge that you came to find whilst battling these demons in yourself? Um, I know that you said you got quite angry. I know you drank quite a bit as well post the event. Was there any bit of education that assisted you get better that you'd recommend people take heed in or look into that could possibly help them in the future? And I also know that dealing with psychological health back then in the police force definitely wasn't up to scratch like it is hopefully today. But was there something that you found primarily really, really assisted you on your individual journey like it always is?
Yeah, mate. Again, great question. My personal journey. I didn't. I had these issues, and I thought it was just me. Yeah, I didn't know anything about psychological trauma. I actually thought that's just for guys who've been through some serious shit. Vietnam veterans, and this is long before Afghanistan kicked off. Um, and I was doing an undergrad degree, and I was in a library at QUT, and reading some police journals. I was there doing an assignment or some stuff, but I used to read US police journals and try to keep abreast of what was happening over there. And I remember reading this article about some feeling symptoms, whatever, that police who'd been in shootings over there were going through. And post-traumatic stress wasn't even defined then. And I can't remember them exactly, but it was things like, self-medication, anger, um, um, sleeplessness, flashbacks. And I remember reading this going, shit, that's me. Wow. And I photocopied this article and I tore out the symptoms of the part, and I kept it in my wallet for years. So when I'd have those bad days, I would literally take this out and go, okay, mate, it's not just you. You're not by yourself. It's not just you. Um, and as I really started my journey to recovery after I left the cops. So I resigned in '95, and I started understanding the impact of counselling in 2006 when I literally had a massive anxiety attack with no cause, no catalyst, just kaboom. The world just crashed on me. Um, and a great friend of mine who I've written about, Mark, who was my mentor, who headhunted me out of the police force, and sadly the black dog got him and he took his own life a few years ago. But Mark rang me and he could tell that I was screwed, and drove over to where I was, calmed me down, put me in touch with his counsellor, and I started counselling that night. Well, I think what has helped me, mate, is a number of things. And first of all, it's connection. It's connection with people like the boys from ISS. It's connection with Police Veterans Victoria that I volunteer as a peer support officer with. It's connection with anybody who's gone through similar things where we can openly talk and share experience. And for me, that was bloody tough initially because it was acknowledging to myself that I wasn't as strong as I thought I was, that in fact I was injured and I was traumatized. I remember, mate, and the connection really started. I hadn't thought about this until right now. I was invited to a Defence Force dinner in Brisbane. Oh, God. Just around the time I think General Cosgrove was appointed Chief of the Army, so whatever year that was. And I was up there as a guest to someone. And I met these two guys from D Company who'd been in the Battle of Long Tan. And we're having a few beers after it, and I can't remember how the conversation started, but I said, but we're all wearing our gongs, and they looked at my gong and said, oh, what's this one for? What's this mean? And I said, oh, yeah, this was a shooting I was in, and I didn't talk much about it, but we'd had a few beers, and I said something like, I have this nightmare, this recurring dream, and I've written about it in the front of the second book. This recurring dream where I'm engaged in something and the fucking trigger on my weapon won't work. And they started to laugh, and I went from niceness to white hot anger in a split second. And one of them said, hey, no, it's all good, man. It's all good. We get it. The only reason we're laughing is we have the same dream. And I went, oh, wow. So we had this whole conversation then, and it started me realizing and thinking about the power of connection. One of these guys I think he was living in Townsville, and he gave me his mobile number. I rang him a couple of times just to have a chat. And then that was enough for me, to know that I wasn't alone. So I think realizing not alone, making connection, mindfulness. I'm on that journey to understand what mindfulness is now. I'm actually taking the time to literally listen to the birds, and smell the air and go for I don't have to run 10Ks and beat the shit out of myself anymore like I used to. I'm okay now to go for a walk and just enjoy the world, and be in the moment. Certainly, drinking. I still like a drink, but I've made a conscious decision not to drink during the week. Although let's see how that goes now with mental leisure. But I've made a conscious decision that's been an escape valve for me. And exercise, man. I'm a martial artist, so I train in 2 dojos in Okinawa and karate. I go to the gym. I hit the bag. I do a couple of 12-round boxing things. 12-round fitness with boxing, and because that's for me is the endorphins and the dopamine. Yeah, and just really, it's not working out stress at all. It's just doing exercise because I love to do it. So mate, yeah, connection, mindfulness, and nutrition, exercise, and cutting down on the booze, and 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 really encouraging other people to talk. I'm a huge advocate for communication. Blokes, we are our own worst enemies. We really are. We're tough guys. We don't want to admit too many things, and what I've known now in the last probably 10 to 15 years is the power of authentic conversation. Where I'll ring someone and go, I'm having a bit of a shit day today, mate. How you doing? And really being more in touch with who we are as human beings rather than being alpha males and presenting that to the world. Because if we have a chink in the armor, someone might think we're not as tough as we think we are. You know what I mean? So that's what's worked for me, buddy.
Mate. Mate, sorry to cut you off, Keith. Mate, I think they're all brilliant, brilliant bloody answers, and I know you've lived it, and you talk about it in the book. And for anybody that hasn't read the book, I implore you very much to do so. But as Keith said, drinking, and he did struggle with demons after this incident. But I really like the answer of realizing that you're not alone, and whether it comes through a conversation with someone else that has been through it, you can only do it through being honest. And chink in the armor, who cares? Those that mind don't matter, and those that matter don't mind. And it's about finding that connection, like you said. But you can't find connection unless you take the proactive step. I didn't set this up. I haven't paid Keith any money under the table for him to say that it was when he was reading that he realized that he wasn't the only person going through this. And that's what it's all about, finding other people, finding that perspective. And Keith, I can imagine when you're in that library that day, you wouldn't have been your mindful, proactive, healthy self like you are today. You would have been gung-ho, angry,
Yeah.
definitely not mindful, and maybe drinking more than you should. But it goes to show that even at our worst, one of the easiest things that we can do is pick up a book and read. And if you know your problem, like Keith, it sounds like you did, then you can learn about it and recover from it and take the correct steps. But we can't do these things unless we have the knowledge to do it. So if you do find yourself in a similar situation, or if you want to arm yourself for future situations that require the stoicness that Keith has displayed this morning in this conversation, then I do implore you to read Keith's book. But Keith, I'll try and I want to say thanks. I think we'll wrap it up there. I'm hoping that you'll be available in the future for another podcast to speak
Mm.
about your actions during the MLC siege, mate.
Yeah.
To talk about any future books. As you know, Brothers and Books is a big fan of yours, and people send through your book all the time to recommend to others, especially the emergency service organisations like the police and the Defence Force, mate. But thanks so much for your time. I think your conversation about what it's like to be an undercover policeman, I think everybody will have a fair grasp of that. And hopefully you stop getting as many questions as to what was it like. But I know you love a chat over a nice beer. So maybe I don't want it to deter that much. And then also your time in the tactical action group, mate. And,
Yeah.
like I said, it wasn't planned, but it is timely to see what can happen on the other side of the fence, noting everything in the media today. This
Yeah.
is the outcome of this is the alternate outcome. Both of them are horrible events. Both are horrible events.
Yeah.
But to look at it in the lens of utilitarianism and who was in the wrong and who was in the right, it's never a good day. But this is what can occur. So I think that's an important, timely conversation and story to tell as well. Keith, before I let you go, mate, a book that you would recommend to our audience. And now it can't be Your Brilliant Gun to the
Oh.
Head or Drugs, Guns and Lies.
Hang on, I'll
I
cross those
know
off
that
the list.
you get around. I know that you get around philosophy. Yeah. Well, what's your third? What's the third book? If you can, and if you want to share anything that you've got upcoming, mate, as
Yeah,
well,
sure.
I'd be happy to hear it, and so
Well,
would the audience that all
thanks,
love your
brother.
books.
Mate, I one book that I think is important for all Australians to read is one that's called Those Ragged Bloody Heroes, written by Peter Brune, Brune. I read it before I walked the Kokoda track back in 2006. And whilst I'd heard of the 39th Militia and their actions during the Kokoda track campaign, I didn't know much about it. This story, man, is about these untrained young blokes who were sent to Port Moresby thinking they were going to be filling sandbags, and then were sent to walk over the track and meet the Japanese head on at Kokoda. And the way that they fought without training, most of them fired their weapons on the bloody way up there on, on the cruise liner, or the troop ship, and the way that they learnt so quickly to survive, and they were dressed in khakis, they had shit gear, against the Japanese South Seas Detachment, who were the best in South in Asia in jungle fighting at that time, and the way they fought, and this magnificent bravery and valor and camaraderie and mateship and sacrifice just blows me away. So those Ragged Bloody Heroes, I highly recommend that. From two quick ones, if I might, because I can talk to you about books for hours, as you know. Mate, there's an American writer called Joseph Wambaugh who wrote a series of books. He was actually a Los Angeles cop, and he wrote a series of books about what it's like to be a cop in LA. And the one I highly recommend is The Choir Boys. And his character building, or writing about his characters, is so true to life. You know, there's a whole mix of police, and a lot of people for years, if they watched, I don't know, 1 Adam 12 or something, they'd think the LAPD are these wonderful guys. Well, he's actually written about human beings who are coppers, and it's funny, it's dark, it's sad, and it's incredibly realistic. So The Choir Boys, highly on the list. The Resilient Shield, man. If ever you see Dan Pronk, tell him how much he's helped me. Wow. So that goes without saying, the Resilient Shield for sure. If you want something a bit different, that is a real good versus evil, it's a book by a guy called Stephen King, the horror writer. But this book is called The Stand, Stand. It is a world, there's a virus. Actually, it's a bit scary. A virus hits the world, kills a large amount of the population, and all that are left are a bunch of people who are good and a bunch of people who are not so good, who gravitate to a person. You can determine for yourself whether it's the devil or not, but and then how they clash with each other. And it is. I read it back in 1980 or something, and still one of my favourite books. I could go for hours, man. But there's a few.
Yeah. Well, mate, that's yeah. I sent some book reviews coming through to the page, mate. And now I know that you're on some leave as well. I'll have to hit you up.
Yeah, hit me up, man.
But yeah, Keith, mate, I can't thank you enough, mate. I can't thank you enough. You're the first ever guest on the show. You're a best-selling author. You're literally, you're one of the most decorated police officers, if not the most decorated police officer in the history of the Australian police force. So I can't thank you enough for coming on the show, mate. And I know you're coming up to Brisbane in a couple of weeks, and I can't wait to see you, mate.
Yep.
So thank you so much for coming on the podcast. And for everybody listening today, you can find Keith Banks just with a simple Google, and his books will come up. I highly recommend it. And I hope that you've got something out of today's podcast like I definitely have. So thank you again, Keith.
Thanks, Dylan, mate. And we will be catching up, mate. We will have beers and we can talk about books and other things during that. Mate, I'm very honoured to be the first guest, man. I really am. And it means a lot to me. Thank you. And mate, as I said, we unite, and I'll happily come back for a number 2. Okay, we can. You and I could talk for hours. So let me know.
But perfect. Thank you, Keith, and thank you everybody for listening.
Okay, brother. See you, mate.